Welcome to That Annuity Show, the podcast that will make you an expert in explaining annuities to your clients. Give us 30 minutes each week and we'll shave hours from your client presentations. Now, here's your host, Paul Tyler.
Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another episode of That Annuity Show. And first of all, I want to welcome my co-host, Mark. How are you?
Well, Paul, how are you?
Well, good to see you.
Always good to be here.
You've been busy. We've missed you on a few of these episodes.
Yeah, duty calls sometimes.
Duty. And of course, Ramsey, thanks for your
great to be here.
Your presence and all those good questions. Well, today, I'll actually do the honors, the introduction. We have with us, I want to introduce Nancy Doyle, who is an MBA and a CFA. She is an author. She's a very successful speaker who talks about a lot of very interesting topics around financial literacy. She's appeared on in the USA News, Reader's Digest, Market Watch, the Huffington Post, MSN, Morningstar, Chicago Tribune, the Kansas City Star, and now, Nancy, you can add the Annuity Show. And in addition, she's an independent consultant advising an ultra high net worth family, focused on investment analysis, asset allocation, cash management. So very interesting perspective. Now, Nancy, your two latest books were Manage Your Financial Life, A Thoughtful and Organized Approach for Women, and then Manage Your Financial Life, just starting out in 2018. And we talked a little bit about this before, but why don't you talk to us just about, we're in the middle of this horrible pandemic, crazy things happening in the market, in other parts of our lives. How do you get your house in financial order today?
Well, that's a great question, Paul. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm really glad to be here. During periods of financial turmoil, inevitably, we take a look at our personal finances and people realize that they may not be as knowledgeable and up to speed as they'd like to be, because with change comes financial change. And so in my books, there are 4 parts to managing your financial life. And I believe that everyone should start with getting organized. Because if we're organized, we have a much better sense for where we are, where we're beginning, and where we want to go, and how prepared we are to manage through difficult times like 2020. So I think the first thing people can do is start with a financial spring cleaning. And it's just like it sounds. We all have far too much paper information in our file cabinets and also on our hard drives. So if you start with an understanding of what you have, where it's located, you're better prepared to go on to the next step, which I call the in case of emergency preparation.
So is this spring house cleaning sort of like Marie Kondo, throw everything in the middle of the floor and say, does this bill spark joy?
Exactly. Or do I need to keep it? Or can I shred it? Or can I recycle it? And I think right now with the pandemic, so many of us are home and both spouses are working from home. This is the perfect time to do it. So once you've gone through your papers and you've determined what you need to keep and how you want to keep it, then you can create 2 tools, which I think are incredibly helpful, are the in case of emergency file and the in case of emergency plan. And the in case of emergency file, you go through your home and you gather up your most important documents, your legal docs, wills, powers of attorney, healthcare directives, your vital docs, birth certificates, social security cards. You also should take copies of your credit cards, passports. And I recommend that everyone go through their home and take a video of your furniture, your contents, anything of value. If you ever have to make an insurance claim, you're glad to have this. Take all this information and put it in a fireproof, floodproof box and make sure that your key person, your partner, knows where this information is. The next step in case of emergency preparation is perhaps even more important these days, and it's the in case of emergency plan. And you've gone through your financial spring cleaning, so you can make a list of all of your financial accounts, how they're titled, the account numbers, and importantly, the contact information. I've talked to so many people who've gone through this exercise and they admitted to me that one of the other partners didn't know some of the important account information, how to get a hold of key people. And as you're going through this exercise, especially right now with all of us being home, you can review your beneficiary designations. You can make sure that one or both of you know all the important passwords for the financial accounts. I like to think of the in case of emergency plan as the roadmap for your financial life. And if you're a financial professional working with clients, this is a great way you can add value to that relationship. Help your clients create these in case of emergency files and in case of emergency plans.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking, this actually would apply to a lot of different parts of the country and a lot of different, we've seen different issues, right? We've seen 2 hurricanes come through one area in the South. We've seen wildfires threaten homes in minutes. I've
floods and other. I mean, it's been a tremendous time from a not to pile on, but from the in addition to the pandemic, a lot of natural disasters. So I think Nancy, so can we back up to one thing?
Sure.
So how do you encourage people to take that initial plunge? Because I was a financial advisor for a number of years, and people do have, I think you mentioned it, their accounts are all over. Sometimes they're electronic, sometimes they're in paper, sometimes they're in file cabinets. And taking that first step can be daunting. So what's your advice or the impetus to get people to just really attack it and take that first step?
That's a great point, Will, because what I've found is I'm traveling around speaking to people about these topics is people want to do this. They're uncomfortable with the fact that their finances are so disorganized. They just don't know how to start. And I think one silver lining of this pandemic is people are at home, and not only are they looking at DIY projects around their house, but this is a time where you can go together. And if you start with that financial spring cleaning, just getting rid of a lot of information, you don't need a 20-year-old tax return. You don't need warranties for appliances that you got rid of 10 years ago. Once you get rid of a lot of the things that you don't need, then you can focus on what you have, and it's less daunting. And that is one of the number one things I hear from people. And especially my first book I wrote for women, because over the years, so many women have reached out to me with questions about their personal finances. And oftentimes they're going through a transition with a financial impact. And there are so many of them, whether it's getting married, starting a business, changing jobs, adopting children, and unfortunately, divorce and widowhood. And those are times that people realize, I don't have a handle on what's going on. And so my recommendation to everyone is do it now, do it before an emergency occurs. Have your ICE file ready. So if you're in Northern California and you have to leave your home in an instant, it's there. And this actually, I benefited from this personally. One of my family members happened to be out of the country when things started happening with COVID, and I was able to get him a plane ticket because I had a copy of his passport and I had his passport number handy. So this is something that benefits all of us.
And Nancy, once you have an emergency plan in place, I've heard you talk about the need for emergency funds or liquidity.
Yes.
What is your general guidance behind, what's the right amount of liquidity to have?
That's a great question, Mark. And one next step I recommend people do, and it's easy to follow on with the ICE plan, is create an asset allocation grid. And that's where you go through and make a list of all of your financial accounts, and then look at each account and how those assets are invested across what types of investments or asset classes. So if you have all of your financial assets in one grid, whether it's a piece of paper, when you use a pencil and calculator, or I recommend people create a simple Excel spreadsheet, then you can look and see where you have liquidity in your various accounts. I also recommend when people do this asset allocation analysis, they start at the top of the grid with their most liquid account, their checking balances, money market, and then work through to retirement, education accounts that are less liquid. If you do this, I also talk about looking at your spending for a 3-month period. If you go to your various transactional accounts, look at your activity over a 3-month period, you have a really good idea what your true essential living expenses are. And, planners recommend that we have at least 3 to 6 or 6 to 9 months of our essential living expenses. if you've done this analysis, you're going to be confident that you have an appropriate amount put away in your emergency reserve. And I like to think of it as an emergency reserve because, especially when I'm talking to people who are just starting out, I, mention this and they say, oh, I can't have that much money in one account. I've got student loan debt, I've got whatever. But if you look across your various accounts, you can see where your sources of liquidity are. And I think going back to the last, the global financial crisis now more than 10 years ago, that's what really caught people off guard is they were far less liquid than they realized.
Yeah, well, let's push a little farther than that, because I think, a lot of people, when you say, well, how much money do you have in the bank, they literally look at what's in the bank or an emergency fund. But liquidity, I think it's easy to kind of, talk quickly past that, right? But you may have some very, what appear to be very illiquid assets, but there is a liquidity component to it, right? Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's why taking this whole holistic view of your personal finances and doing it with your partner, so everybody understands that if something happens, this is where we tap liquidity. We don't go here, we go here if in fact we need to access money quickly. And no, I think you raise an excellent point, because I think in a panic mode during a pandemic, people are now, of course, things were different this year because there were accommodations made to allow people to access retirement accounts and other accounts without the usual penalties. But in my view, if you can avoid tapping those assets, even if there is no penalty for a period of time, you should do it, because it's so important to allow those assets to grow. Those are your longest term goals, and you really should try not to tap those if you don't have to.
Going back to spending, you mentioned, looking at 3 months spending, and I know you've got breakdowns in terms of spending patterns, like X% should be for essential, discretionary towards savings. Can you talk to that a little bit? And also, does that change as people get closer to retirement?
Definitely. That's a great point, Mark. I like to talk about, the financial planners often talk about the 50-30-20 rule. And if you go through and you categorize your spending by spending type, whether it's rent, entertainment, you have an HOA, health club, whatever you're spending your money on, and look at what percentage of those expenses are going toward essentials. So financial planners recommend we spend no more than 50% of our take-home pay on essentials, housing, food, utilities, no more than 30% of our take-home pay on the non-essentials. These are the wants, the hobbies, the things that make life fun, which means if you do the math, you'll have at least 20% towards savings and paying down debt. And I recommend that people do this analysis. The first time you do it, I highly doubt that any of us would wind up at 50-30-20, but it gives you an idea of where you can look at your spending and make some changes to free up more cash for savings in particular. Because those people who are, say, looking at their retirement goals and they realize they're not where they want to be, or maybe they change course and decide to start a business or take on some other financial commitment, this analysis is the most useful tool to help them figure out where they can find that money.
Great.
So Nancy, this is fantastic advice. And as we listen to all of it, I come to the conclusion that, wow, this is a ton of work, and it's daunting for somebody to do on their own. Very interested to hear your perspective on when people should think about bringing in outside financial advice. And something that you said as we're preparing for this call is that even you, with all the knowledge you have, you also rely on a financial advisor as well. So your perspective on when one should bring one in, and then the fact that like everybody, no matter how sophisticated could potentially use one, would be very interesting.
Definitely, Ramsey. Well, I agree with you that I am a big fan of seeking financial advice, because it's an independent view of your situation. I think it can be daunting, and several people I've spoken with in my various talks and presentations, that's the biggest hurdle, is I don't know where to get started. And I really do believe that once you go through and clear out what you don't need to keep anymore, do your financial spring cleaning, prepare your ICE plan, and have a handle on what's where, then I think you're in a better position to meet with someone and start to get some independent advice. Another thing I like to talk to people about is oftentimes I speak a lot with financial advisors about their clients. And I think financial advisors would prefer that if they have a family relationship or a couple, that both members of that couple were involved in that financial relationship. And unfortunately, that's not often the case. But I remind people I'm speaking to, especially women, that two people working together are going to make better financial decisions than any one person working on their own. And that's been proven with behavioral finance studies. So I think if we can get our financial houses in order, at least get started, we'll feel more empowered and we're better able to then shift toward working with someone. Now, I think when people are going through big life transitions, that's when you have to analyze your spending, take an objective view of your profile. Those are, I think, perhaps the most important times to work with a financial advisor. And there's so many transitions in our life that have a financial impact. That's when I would recommend doing that.
Yeah, one thing we've heard, talking to a couple of people is and you're kind of reinforcing after you heard it a couple of times, you said, this is an interesting theme, is the importance of communication in a plan. In some regards, the pandemic has actually, I think, made it easier. You're either living in the same house or you're all at home and you've learned how to use Zoom. I mean, do you see new potential for at least the quality of communication that comes in the planning process?
I think communication is, I like to say, is probably the fourth step in getting your financial house in order, because there's also a major trend in the US that you are all aware of, with more and more people serving as financial caregivers, stepping in and helping someone else manage their finances. And I think that is not something that happens overnight. That's a process. And I think by preparing your ICE plan, your asset allocation grid, doing your financial spring cleaning, all of these steps will help you be in a better position to trust someone to take over helping you with your financial affairs. Or if you've been asked to serve as a financial caregiver for someone else, either in a formal capacity or informal capacity, that's, to Ramsey's point, you can help them go through this process of going through their papers, figuring out what they have. Because we're all clearing out clutter now in our homes. And I think that we should take the same approach with our finances. And I also think during periods of turmoil, it's scary, it's unnerving. And I think that's when families, whether it's your nuclear family unit, speaking with your parents, you're helping your friends or siblings, that's when it's important to have these honest discussions so people are less overwhelmed with the financial impact of what's been happening this year.
Now, if we had one of those bins outside that says "Do not keep," after my last weekend, I tell you, my wife would have had me in that "Do not keep" one. What's the difference? Think of, I don't want to stereotype, but if, I'm an advisor, I'm trying to, I'm either involving, the female spouse, or I'm having a conversation directly with a single woman. Any type of advice? I mean, is there a different way to approach a woman than it would be a man in a process like this?
There's a lot of debate about this. And some people say to me, well, Nancy, I actually heard one young woman who said to her mother, when my first book came out, I'm not going to read Mrs. Doyle's book because I'm going to invest like a man. And no offense to the panel here, but you're probably aware that women have a very good track record with investing.
Yeah.
And so I shared that with my friend. But I think women are different in many ways in terms of how they approach their financial lives. I think women are very goal oriented. I think women are very focused on, are my children going to be okay? Am I going to be able to take care of myself if there's a life transition and I'm on my own? I mean, we've all seen the statistics, how many women at some point in their life are going to be managing their own finances. So I think this goal-driven approach, and I don't think you can really talk about your financial goals until you have an idea of where you're starting, what you have now. And I like to think about goals in terms of time horizons. So you have the near-term goals, to Mark's point, talking about, do you have the emergency funds now? That should be a top goal. And then it should be your retirement. I mean, even when I'm speaking I do a number of talks for people who are college age or just starting out in the workforce. You have to start thinking about your retirement. And then you can think about the intermediate term goals. Maybe you want a vacation home, or you want, some other, you have some other financial objective in mind. And so I think you have to think about the goals in terms of the time horizons. And another thing I've heard from several women's groups that I've spoken with is the need for financial professionals to listen better. And I think that that's a concern I hear from so many women who've reached out to me and say, I want to find someone to work with to help me manage my finances, or just at general talks when we're opening it up for Q&A. That's something that I hear from them is, I wish I could find someone who could listen better to me and my ideas. So I don't know if that's helpful to the audience, but I think that is something that hopefully financial professionals can keep in mind.
Well, it's interesting as I've become an entrepreneur, I've spent a lot more time thinking about financial planning because it's integral to the business model. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is that I think that financial planning and financial advice often focus a lot on things like asset allocation and focus on products, focus on stock picking. But I've come to the conclusion that in many cases, the highest value added thing to do is focus on budgeting and expense forecasting and the like. And so to find that kind of financial advisor, if that's what you need, I would ask you, where would you go to do that? And what kind of questions would you ask a financial advisor up front to make sure that they're focusing on those issues rather than products necessarily? By the way, I'm in the product business. I have nothing against products. I just think that like the door to the right product is getting these first questions answered in the best possible way.
Well, and I think you're not going to know if a product is right for a client until you listen to what their needs and objectives are.
Exactly.
And I think and people ask me when I'm interviewing financial professionals, what are the questions I should ask? And that comes up, that's important. And I also recommend that, first of all, people start with getting referrals from family and friends. And it's not just someone you know socially or someone you know from church or your neighborhood. It should be referrals from friends and family that have worked with this financial professional in a professional capacity. I think that those referrals go a long way. And I think I would also recommend that people interview at least 3 different financial advisors so you get a sense for, or financial professionals, whether it's an accountant, insurance agent. Interview at least a couple, because then you get a sense for the differences. There are different styles, there are different approaches. I think that it's key to understand that person's process, how they go about helping their clients. Ask them to walk you through, how do you set up a plan? How do you determine what insurance is right for your clients? When think of it as you're interviewing a potential employee, because that's effectively what you're doing. And then I also think it's important to have a good rapport. Back to Paul's point, you need to be able to communicate with these people. And so often when I'm talking to groups, primarily female groups, I get the question, well, I don't want to ask this question of my insurance agent, financial advisor, fill in the blank, because I don't want to look stupid. And I get that question comes up every single time I speak. So Nancy, I'm going to ask you this question. And I remind them that the financial professionals that we work with in our lives are paid to answer our questions. So when you're interviewing a financial professional, you should make sure that you feel completely comfortable asking him or her questions and having that open communication.
Yeah, Nancy, I couldn't agree with you more. And before I became, involved in compliance, I mentioned earlier I was a registered rep selling, doing plans and selling mutual funds, asset allocation models, et cetera, some annuities. But you're hitting the nail on the head. I think the relationship building and the kind of getting to know the client and the advisor was really, really, really critical. And I wanted to comment on something else you mentioned, because I'm seeing it around my neighborhood in Connecticut. People are putting out all kinds of free stuff. They're cleaning out everything in their house. And when I was a registered rep, people will come in with boxes and boxes of paperwork, and some of it was so old, to your earlier point, that it was really not needed at all, but kept. And then one other comment about how important it is to get these affairs in order. At the insurance company where several of us work, we often get requests from beneficiaries on policies that are so old or just misplaced or found after, after the death of a parent or grandparent. So if there was some semblance of organization with people's, papers, affairs, financial documents, it would make not only your lives easier, but those in the future that will have to deal with those affairs later. It would make their lives easier as well.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I mentioned this in my book that I know of at least 3 people, frankly, myself included, that going through our late parents' papers found insurance policies that were still in effect. So when you go through this financial spring cleaning, it is not open the dumpster, throw things in there. You have to go through with care and look at every document. I know that other people have found really important sentimental items tucked away within financial files, important letters, photographs, things that are truly sentimental. I also think we need to be very careful about identity theft. And so many people I talk to say, well, I'm just going to put this all out in the recycling bin. I'm like, no. Go have it shredded. And there's a number of firms that you can go to the shredding location, contactless, have them open your car. You can watch them put the documents in the machine and shred them before your eyes. It's incredibly secure. And I believe almost all, if not all of it, is recycled. So when you do a big financial spring cleaning, you could have a carload full of documents. And even if someone's deceased, you have to protect their identity. So I recommend, and it's not expensive, maybe 50 cents a pound. It's money well spent. I don't enjoy shredding that much. I would rather have someone else do it for me, but I can watch them do it and I know it's secure.
Okay, so I have to come back to the other aspect. This is great, by the way. I mean, I'm writing these things down. Probably do them in my house, and we'll probably, offer to do it for some of our other policyholders as well in some form. High net worth individuals, like, okay, they don't have that problem, right? What are the questions? What are their problems? Must not be mine. They must be asking a different set of questions.
No, I think for the family that I work for, there are some similarities and there's some differences. Literally just a couple of weeks ago, I had to look through files and find the cost basis for a mutual fund that had been sold a long time ago because it had been missed. I mean, we're still keeping track of a lot of information. Obviously, there's a lot more accounts, a lot more pieces going on. But one of the things that was important this year to us was looking at our liquidity. Because when you're investing for ultra high net worth families, there's a fair bit of illiquid and long tail investments, in particular private equity, where you don't know the pace of distributions when the public markets could close down. The M&A activity could close down. Now it hasn't, but we had to be prepared that we had sufficient liquidity to meet the near-term needs of the beneficiaries. So it really goes across all income spectrums, this focus on liquidity and being prepared.
Nancy, we talk a lot about, technology's influence in our business, and obviously it's changed a lot in terms of the dynamic of it. And we talk about the pros of it a lot. Are there any cons that you see that can impact investors and their behavior as it relates to the technology influence?
Well, a couple of things. I think, first of all, we've seen during 2020 a rise in especially younger people, actively trading stocks. And I'm not sure, it's fine if it's done, in a limited fashion, but I'm concerned that some of these younger people don't understand really the scope of what they're doing, and they're not as well informed, and they don't understand market volatility, which, I've never seen the VIX like it has been this year in my 30 years in the business. So that, I think it's fine if people want to learn about that and do it to some extent. One thing that I'm frankly more concerned about in terms of technology, aside from identity theft and fraud, is the fact that nowadays we're transacting across multiple platforms. And I think that makes it even more difficult for people to keep track of their spending. And fortunately, with the peer-to-peer platforms, you can also look at your spending activity over a period of time. I think this is something that affects those just starting out in the workforce more, because I think that they're overdrawing their accounts because they're just not keeping track. I also know that people who are younger and just starting out in the workforce are significantly more likely to be the victim of a scam or a fraud because they're so comfortable with sharing their personal information on social media. And that's where the hackers get the information about, oh, where was your high school? What, all those password secret codes or whatever secret questions we have in our passwords. So those are two things I'm a little concerned about. I think that we still have to remember, no matter how we're transacting, how we're investing, that we have to protect our identity and be safe with our information.
How about in
Yeah,
terms
good.
of
Oh,
how
go
about in
ahead,
terms
Mark.
of
Go
people
ahead, go ahead, Mark.
focusing in on the long term for investing? I mean, you think about the immediate gratification that comes with technology today. Like people can access virtually any piece of information they want. Does that make the mindset change in terms of focusing on, the short term versus the long term?
I think in many ways, I think the real-time access to all of our accounts is beneficial because we're not waiting for a statement to come at the end of the month, and then we've got a number of paper statements. We're trying to aggregate our information. I think it's powerful, both in the short term and the long term. I think that we're better able to plan because there's so many wonderful planning tools. And in terms of the retirement calculators and all the things that we can assess where we are in terms of our long-term goals are helpful. But what I do caution people is that when they look at the return calculators, make sure to understand what they're assuming for an annualized rate of return in your investments, because sometimes I've looked at a lot of tools and I've also heard a lot of financial experts talk about the assumptions you can make about, you hear that 10% for the long-term return in the markets over the past 40, whatever your time horizon. And that's true. But if you look at a shorter term time horizon, it's not 10%. And I'm not comfortable with using a 10% return expectation as you're planning for retirement. So I think in the near term, tracking our spending is a good thing, as long as you're looking at all the platforms. Long term, I think these tools are great for planning, but you just have to make sure that those return assumptions are realistic.
Yeah, great advice. So I guess, first of all, thanks so much for spending time with us. Any final questions?
No, just a comment. I think a lot of what you shared is really, really, really helpful. And I think Ramsey mentioned this, but given our audience, a lot of our audience is agents or producers or financial professionals. I mean, they can, it's a transferable skill that you were just discussing, where I think these agents and producers can use a lot of the tips that we just reviewed with you that with their clients, even an opportunity to kind of re-engage clients they may not have talked to recently. So really helpful information, and really appreciate your perspective.
Well, thank you. And I think this is the information that people want. This is a tool that you can really add value to that relationship. And this is something is in very high demand, especially for women that I've spoken with. So hopefully it'll be helpful to your audience.
So I was just going to add that, some of the perspectives that you highlighted there, I think, are very important. So you mentioned technology and young people, younger folks, and the investment decisions they're making. So there's at least one situation where a ton of money was invested in a bankrupt company earlier this year. That's one example. And I think that, just some basic sound financial advice can help set people on the right course there. And then I also thought your comment about the availability of financial models online and elsewhere. It has always sort of struck me as very interesting that whoever hops onto the model gets to kind of choose their return assumption without any necessarily any knowledge of what makes sense. And so these are really, really very important things. And we had Moshe Milevsky on a couple of weeks ago, and that was really the centerpiece of what he was saying, is that we all need to better understand the assumptions that we're making and why. So anyway, with all that, thank you very much for your comments today.
Well, glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Really enjoyed it.
Hey, well, thanks so much, Nancy. And what's the best place for us to find your books, follow you, or ask other questions of you?
Well, sure. Again, my books are Manage Your Financial Life, A Thoughtful, Organized Approach for Women, and Manage Your Financial Life, Just Starting Out. You can go to my website, which is Manage Your Financial Life. My speaking website is nancydoyle.com, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Nancy Finance.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, Ramsey, Mark, Will. Thank you. And tune in
Thanks.
next. Hey, thank you. And tune in next week for another great episode of the Annuity Show. Make sure you subscribe to us. Come to our website, put your name on our email list, and we'll make sure we'll send you an email so you don't miss great episodes like these. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend us on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information at thatannuityshow.com.